Unfortunately, no. OPEC took a gamble and cut production last year in the hopes of creating a new floor for oil pricing, and it worked temporarily. But what we've seen is that particularly the American producers who are nimble, who are well-financed, who have relatively low costs of production, particularly all of the peripheral costs around production, logistics, training, et cetera, tax environment in which they work, are all pretty competitive. And they've been able to ramp up and assume that supply gap. And I think that there's enough money on the table now at $50 a barrel for them to continue producing, so that we may even see further softening of prices below $50. That, of course, is not good news for Venezuela or Colombia or Ecuador. And I think that those economies and those governments need to govern themselves and their fiscal constraints with that reality. There's no question that the Odebrecht scandal, the Lava Jato scandal in Brazil, and the lawsuits that it has provoked, both in Brazil and then after that in New York from shareholders, and now we're seeing across the region where Odebrecht has operated, is definitely giving pause to investors. So the biggest reason for their concern is that in any of these countries, Colombia or Peru, you tend to rely on a small number of large, well-financed, generally well-managed construction outfits. Those outfits were also partners to Odebrecht in many of the Odebrecht projects in these countries. So until they are vetted through the political process, through this litigation process, and the truth comes to light as to their involvement or not, then I think that lenders are going to be reticent to backing projects that involve them. And any significant project in these countries will almost have to involve them. So yes, I think it's a shame because the money's there and the need is there to build this infrastructure, but this is a major political risk obstacle for anyone involved in these projects, from the policymakers to the lenders to the construction outfits themselves. So there are certain economic trends that affect all of Latin America. But when it comes to politics, politics is local. And you cannot talk about sweeping trends when it comes to politics. So you have to take each country at a time. In Venezuela, they've had 20 years of Chavismo. The voters definitely voted their disapproval of the party in the midterm elections a year and a half ago. And I don't foresee any quick turnaround in Venezuela that would lead them to choose a sort of populist leadership. They are sick of populism and they're ready for something different. Now, the opposition is somewhat fragmented and not very unified in Venezuela, but I don't see any change in government in the form of populism there. In Ecuador, similarly, Correa, perhaps a more effective populist with a little more fiscal control, nonetheless is struggling in this election after the first round to maintain his party's control of the presidency. They do control the legislature, but it is somewhat doubtful that his party, Alianza País, will win the presidency. It's a close race in the second round, but I think that probably the voters will choose the opposition, which is a businessman Lasso of a centrist sort of political bent. In Colombia, Colombia probably, of all the countries in Latin America, probably has the most grounded and healthy political party system. And so I don't see the incursion of populism. Now, Uribe is kind of an interesting mix. He has a kind of a populist approach in terms of how he campaigns, even the way he governs. He's the hombre indispensable sort of approach, where he attacks problems firsthand, and people respond to that well. But he's also backed by a party in a system where the Congress is diverse, and I don't see populism encroaching in Colombia either. In Bolivia, certainly there's a possibility, but because the political opposition has really been damaged over the years of Evo Morales in power. So that's a tougher jurisdiction to predict. I think in Bolivia, to win an election, you certainly have to appear as a populist, you have to speak as a populist. But what we've seen, to govern Bolivia, you have to be somewhat fiscally conservative. And so I do think Bolivia is a place where populism, albeit well-governed populism, could continue. Well, Peru is a really interesting sort of political animal. The party system that was strong there 20 years ago has eroded. And it is very much, the presidential race each time is very much a personality contest. Peru is also a country where you have a quite prosperous coastal and capital city, but a very impoverished Sierra and eastern portion of the country. And that division and that impoverished area represents about 40% of the votes. So every time there's an election, the specter of populism is there. I think that today we have a relatively fresh administration, but their ability to govern has shown some cracks. They've been caught, I think, naively without discipline amongst their senior cabinet. They've lost 2 cabinet ministers, a third now just because of political rivalry by Keiko Fujimori's party. I think that Kuczynski is learning that he needs to govern in concert with the congressional leadership of Keiko Fujimori. Without her support, it's going to be difficult to implement the kind of bold infrastructure plans that he has. The money's there, the vision's there, competent government is there, but without congressional support, it'll be difficult. So I think that in Peru, which I didn't comment on the earlier question, is a country that's always vulnerable to populism for the factors I mentioned. But right now, I don't see that as an immediate threat. In Venezuela, last year, the gold reserves, which make up probably 90% of the reserves at this point, depleted by 31% in terms of gold volume, about 23% in value because gold appreciated somewhat. So how many months do they have left, if you like, before they run out of money? Probably more than a year, probably a year and a half, maybe even stretched to 2 years. That's enough time to get us to the next presidential election term, which is April 2018. At that point, if there are free and fair elections, as there were in the midterms, then the PSUV, the Chavistas, will not win the presidency. They will lose the presidency. I do not foresee them regaining popularity enough to hold the presidency. So there's going to be an effort over the next 13 months ahead of those elections by the Chavista leadership to somehow negotiate long-term impunity for themselves once they're kicked out of power. Much like we've seen in the past at the end of civil wars in Chile and Nicaragua, they're going to try to do the same. I'm not sure that they'll succeed, but it may be a smart thing to give them